exhilarating session, that is speech that you gave on healthcare. Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. Just to pick up from where you left, and completely in agreement with you before I come to what Rana asked me, is this linkage between climate and health? You know, I'm very encouraged with this particular session because I've been in this, toying around in this climate space almost for the last 7 years now. And I have been in this session, public health session, a few times, but climate did not really find its necessary place on the linkage, and today we are trying to talk about climate health nexus. And maybe it started with the Lancet paper, which actually called climate change the biggest public health disaster right now. And now let me start by picking up from what Santosh said on market and information failure, completely in agreement with it. And let me just add to what he said by compounding. The 2006 Cloudstone report was very clear that climate change is created because of the biggest market failure in human history of not being able to internalize all the externalities that were created by, quote unquote, the private sector. This brings me to a starting point of when Santosh said in terms of private sector does not make enough return on capital because those rates are unaffordable. And that's not only CGHS. Actually, the precursor to PMJ is RSBY, which started ages ago. In terms of, I think RSBY started in 2011. There also the problem was the same. There also the problem was standardization. There also the problem was how do you standardize those costs and returns on the procedure. So things, that information still exists. That information asymmetry will be existing, and therefore you will not be able to get markets to work. And that brings me to what Rana asked in terms of resilience infrastructure, which basically takes me to the same point of what I have been seeing in the climate fraternity is that why isn't private capital going in and why isn't private investment happening? And thanks, in fact, as you put in these questions, Rana, into this is you indicated to public-private partnerships, and that's possibly the way to go for infrastructure, climate resilient healthcare and infrastructure. But let me step back and explain the nexus a little. Where is this nexus coming from? See, the adaptation part, the impact of climate change is essentially affects health in a few ways. So what it does actually is, there is a concept in climate of physical risk. And what is it about? It is about saying the severity and the frequency, you multiply both, you get the impact. The severity and frequency of climate events is increasing and getting increasingly randomized, which means that even stochastic models and AI cannot pick up because at some point of time it depends on learning, but maybe generative AI would be able to do because it dynamically learns. So the whole issue is around changing precipitation, heat, temperature fluctuations, or rather on the warming side, which are the acute ones, and storms, urban flooding, cyclones. The frequencies have shifted, and if you look at the east coast of India, you will see from one event in maybe 5 years to 5 events in 1 year. So that's the shift that has happened in last 10 years. Now, the whole question is how does this affect and what is it? Is it infrastructure only? No, it's not infrastructure only. Because the impact of this is a lot on different stages of healthcare. Now, there is a preventive aspect of healthcare, there is a curative or curative aspect of healthcare, and there is a management aspect of healthcare in which you can simply talk of and think of as primary and vaccination, secondary and tertiary healthcare going ahead. Now what happens is, now while all these events are imposing a stress on the public healthcare system, so therefore the need of systems and institutional capacity, and Rana, it's not only infrastructure, while the infrastructure needs to be made resilient to more water, more rain, more temperature, for sure. But we also need to see that the vaccination vax-cooler chain is in place to be able to address this differential. We also need to be able to see And what Santosh referred to as new diseases is actually the emergence of zoonotic viruses is significantly increasing and shifting, because you might easily expect another COVID-like situation, because this mutation is increasing because of climate change. So you have one more variable. And the third thing is, as such, we are not able to handle communicable diseases in India, the vector-borne ones. I stay in Gurgaon, which has a dengue outbreak right now. So the issue is the vector-borne diseases, particularly water, and the water vector-borne communicable diseases have to be focused on to be treated effectively and maybe preventively to a certain extent, that Santosh was talking about, if we could only prevent it. So therefore, our entire view on healthcare provisioning, first, we cannot rely on the markets to provide healthcare, very, very clearly. The question is, it's a different political question, but our expenditure on healthcare have stagnated at 2 to 2.5% over the last 25 years. That's the public investment. The public investment is on what? It needs to be on merit goods. And you see in India, typically public investment on primary education and healthcare have stagnated, the two basic SDGs that we are dealing with. Now, that cannot happen, that needs to change, because private provisioning and markets handling this kind of healthcare situation, at least at the primary and the secondary healthcare, I think there is something gone terribly wrong. And that terribly wrong tells me, I don't work in healthcare, I work in climate today and climate environment and financing over there. Over there, I also find the same thing, because the whole Western, I would say clearly development bank and Western MDB and Western led issue of saying that you need to transition out, because the space for growth for developing economies needs to be there, because let's clearly understand, this problem has not been created by Asia, this problem has been created by the West. It's like a stock of food which was available, which you have already, the West has eaten up 400 of the 450. Now you are being told in Asia that look, you didn't need to change, but why did you solve that problem in the first place, and there's no money on the table? And that's the point in climate negotiation, therefore loss and disaster, and that needs to contribute to paying for the impact that is happening. So one of the ways of bringing to financing, yes, public-private partnerships need to be brought about for healthcare infrastructure for sure, but at the same time, there has to be a compensation mechanism globally on loss and damage, which is a discussion that no one does at COP significantly, is to say that there is early warning systems, but there is disaster management expenditure too, which also will fall on healthcare, because at the end of the day, what will those people do? Those people will go into the public hospitals only. Second, you need to set up infrastructure like, let's talk about cyclone shelters, let's talk about cool roofs, let's talk about all urban resilience infrastructure have got a significant heat impact. And we have not yet brought in cleaner air. India is housed to at least probably top 8 of the 10 most air polluted cities are in India. That's not necessarily contributed by climate change. It's not carbon dioxide, but that has a significant impact on health, on respiratory diseases and subsequent lifestyle diseases too. So there is a cost to be borne. The cost of unclean air is humongous. And we need to get this addressing, and yes, here I bring in again the issue of getting the systems and the process right. Because if you see the allocations to clean air, 90% of that remains unused. Because government budgeting, because you need to have a demand from the respective constituencies for the government budget to be spent out and used. And that does not happen. Now, once you put it out as public-private or private-public partnerships in terms of concessions, what you've done in infrastructure for healthcare, that brings in adequate return on capital for the private sector investor to invest. And whether it is in SNCUs or whether it is in diagnostic imaging, whether it is in primary healthcare, as long as you can ensure that with a viability gap funding, I think these models will work. But at the same point of time, let's also understand that the allocation of public finance needs to be increased, because the uncertainty is high, and the uncertainty is effectively going to affect the lives of people in terms of most vulnerable. If you look at the DST mapping, Department of Science and Technology has mapped, and we also from CEW, we have a physical risk atlas in which we can actually go down to 25 square kilometers, but the Government of India's vulnerability map is on district level. Look at the district level, we need to prioritize, we need to look at those districts, and this needs to get reflected into the Finance Commission allocation. Currently, it does not find a space. And finally, I'll end with the need for private investment needs to be enabled by the public sector, and that public sector needs to find its allocation even through the Finance Commission and through the missions of National Health Mission, both urban and rural. Thank you.